The trap snaps. But it's not a rabbit. Ethan sat under a twisted, dead-looking tree, his stomach twisting in hunger. The red sky above was darkening, and the twin moons of this strange planet had started to rise. He had been here for 6 days. 6 long, exhausting days since he woke up alone, stranded and lost. His hands tightened around the sharp rock in his grip. No food, no water, no idea where he was. The only thing keeping him alive was his training. He had been a survival expert back on Earth, a skill that felt useless in the cold metal walls of spaceships. But now it was all he had. He had set a trap hours ago, hoping to catch one of the small rat-like creatures that scurried in the tall purple grass. If he was lucky, he would have a meal before nightfall. A sudden snap echoed through the silent air. Ethan's head jerked up. The trap. His heart pounded as he grabbed his crude spear, a stick with a sharpened stone at the end, and moved toward the noise. He stayed low, stepping carefully. The last thing he wanted was to attract one of the larger creatures that stalked these lands at night. The trap was just ahead, near the edge of the rocky clearing. The thick grass swayed gently in the wind, but Ethan felt something wrong. The air was too still. The usual hum of insects and distant howls had vanished. He swallowed, gripping his weapon tighter. He took slow steps forward, his breathing controlled. Finally, he saw the trap. It was closed. Something had been caught. But when Ethan got closer, his stomach twisted. It wasn't a rat-like creature. Inside the wooden snare, tangled in the fibers, was a strange, pulsating object. It was black and silver, shaped like a rough stone, but covered in thin, glowing blue lines. It looked almost alive. It wasn't moving, but Ethan could hear something. A faint hum, like an engine idling in the distance. A machine. A creature. Ethan stepped back, his instincts screaming. This wasn't normal. Then the forest behind him moved. A shadow shifted among the trees. Something huge was watching him. Ethan froze. His muscles tensed. He had seen strange creatures on this planet before. Some that ran, some that crawled, and some that stalked in silence. But this felt different. The presence was too still, too calm. He slowly crouched, keeping his eyes on the trap. If he ran, whatever was out there would chase him. If he stayed, it might come closer. The humming noise from the trapped object grew louder. Ethan clenched his jaw. He needed to move. Now. He reached forward carefully, trying to loosen the snare around the strange device. His fingers brushed against the surface, cold, smooth, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then it blinked. A sharp electric spark shot through his hand. Ethan yanked his arm back, biting down a curse. His skin tingled, as if tiny needles had pricked him. The object flickered, and suddenly, the forest behind him came alive. Branches snapped. The ground trembled. Something was running toward him. Ethan spun, heart pounding. In the fading light, he saw it. Tall, lean, moving on 2 legs, glowing blue eyes locked on him. An alien. Not an animal. Not a wild beast. A predator. Ethan's breath hitched. It was watching him. Not attacking. Not running. Just watching. Then, to his shock, the alien lowered itself slightly, tilting its head. Ethan realized what was happening. It wasn't just looking at him. It was studying him. He felt like prey. The object in the trap continued to hum, vibrating against the dirt. The alien's eyes flicked toward it, then back to Ethan. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind howled through the trees. The night deepened. Then, the alien slowly reached down and placed something on the ground. A chunk of meat. Ethan stared, confused. The alien said nothing. No sound, no movement. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, it melted back into the darkness, vanishing among the trees. Ethan's fingers clenched around his spear. His breathing was rough. His pulse thundered in his ears. What had just happened? He looked at the piece of meat, then at the trapped object. His instincts screamed two things. 1. That alien wasn't hunting him. 2. Whatever he had caught in that trap wasn't food. It was something much, much worse. The predator and the prey. Ethan didn't move for a long time. The night had fully settled in, the twin moons casting a pale, ghostly glow over the clearing. The alien had disappeared, but the weight of its presence still lingered in the air. The object in the trap continued to pulse softly, like a machine breathing, its blue lines flickering in an odd rhythm. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. His mind was racing. The alien had left food. Why? Nothing on this planet had shown signs of intelligence before. Everything was either trying to eat him or ignoring him completely. But this one, it had watched him. It had offered food. That wasn't the action of a mindless beast. Ethan finally crouched and picked up the hunk of meat. It was dark and firm, almost rubbery, with a faint metallic sheen. His instinct screamed not to eat it, but if the alien had meant harm, there were 1,000 easier ways to kill him. Still, Ethan wasn't stupid. He set the meat aside and focused on the trap device. It was clearly alien technology, something that didn't belong in the wild. He carefully loosened the snare and pulled the object free. It felt unnatural, cold at first, but warming in his hands. A weapon, a communicator, a tracker. He didn't know. But what he did know was that whoever, or whatever, had left that food had also wanted this back. And that meant it was important. The forest watches. Ethan didn't go back to his makeshift shelter. Instead, he climbed up onto a high rocky ledge a few 100 feet away, where he had a clear view of the clearing. He needed to see what happened next. Hours passed. The night creatures began to stir, strange, slithering things in the grass, silent wings gliding through the air. Ethan remained completely still, watching. Then, movement. The alien returned. It stepped into the clearing with slow, calculated movements. It was taller than he remembered. Its body wrapped in dark, organic armor, smooth and shifting like living metal. The blue glow in its eyes pulsed as it scanned the area. It went straight for the trap. Ethan tensed. The alien crouched and touched the spot where the device had been. Its fingers pressed into the dirt, tracing the marks Ethan had left. It knew. It knew he had taken it. For the first time since landing on this planet, Ethan felt something worse than fear. He felt hunted. The alien rose, its glowing eyes scanning the darkness. Then, something unexpected happened. It turned its head slightly, toward another part of the forest. Ethan followed its gaze, and that's when he saw it. Not alone. A second figure stood at the edge of the trees. It was different. Thinner, weaker. Its body was wrapped in the same dark material, but it wasn't smooth like the first ones. It looked damaged, wounded. The first alien, the hunter, stared at the second, unmoving. Ethan held his breath. Then, the second figure took one slow step forward. The hunter reacted instantly. Its body tensed, shifting its weight slightly. A warning. Ethan felt it, even from a distance. It wasn't just a stare. It was a challenge. The second alien hesitated. The hunter didn't move. Then, without warning, the second one vanished into the trees. It didn't run. It didn't retreat. It simply melted into the shadows. And just like that, the hunter was alone again. Ethan exhaled slowly. That had not been an animal encounter. That had been something else. A rivalry. A conflict. A war. Whatever was happening, Ethan had just stepped into the middle of it. The first contact. The hunter lingered in the clearing for a while. Then, in a single fluid motion, it reached into a small compartment on its side and pulled out something small. It placed it carefully on the ground. Then, without a sound, it disappeared into the night. Ethan waited until the silence stretched long and deep. Only then did he climb down from his vantage point and move toward the clearing. His pulse quickened when he saw what had been left behind. It wasn't another piece of meat. It was a symbol, a rough drawing made from crushed, glowing minerals. 3 circles. 2 were crossed out. 1 remained untouched. Ethan stared at it, his mind working furiously. 3 species. 2 gone. Only 1 left. And somehow, he knew exactly what it meant. This was a test, and humanity. It was next. The silent communication. Ethan crouched beside the glowing symbols, his breath slow and controlled. 3 circles. 2 crossed out. 1 left untouched. The meaning was clear. 2 species were gone. 1 remained. But what did that mean for him? Was he the next target, or the next participant in some unknown game? The idea sent a chill down his spine. The alien, the hunter, had left this message deliberately. It wanted him to see it. It wanted him to understand. But the real question was, why? The offer of survival. Ethan scanned the area. The hunter was gone, but that didn't mean he was alone. He had learned one thing in his time on this planet. There were always eyes watching. He slowly reached into his pack and pulled out the strange device he had taken from the trap. The black and silver object still pulsed faintly, humming like a distant engine. The hunter had wanted it back. Maybe it was a weapon. Maybe it was a beacon. Maybe it was something far more dangerous. Ethan had 2 choices: leave it behind and walk away. Keep it and see where the mystery led. His instincts screamed at him to leave it alone. Every survival rule said never mess with things you don't understand. But his gut told him something else. If the alien had wanted to kill him, it would have done so already. But it didn't. Instead, it left food. It left a message. That wasn't an attack. That was communication. And Ethan needed answers. He carefully picked up the glowing minerals the alien had used to draw the circles. Slowly, he dragged his fingers through the dirt beside the original symbol and drew a 4th circle. Then, hesitating only for a second, he reached out and crossed it out. A direct challenge. A question. What happens when the 3rd species is gone? Then he stood up and walked away, leaving the message behind. If the hunter wanted a conversation, it had one now. The other presence. Ethan didn't go far. He climbed a nearby jagged rock formation and settled in, hiding between the cracks. From here, he had a clear view of the clearing. Now he waited. Hours passed. Nothing. His body ached from staying still, but he forced himself to remain silent, to blend into the landscape. If the hunter came back, he needed to see its reaction. And then, movement. But it wasn't the hunter. It was the other one. The thin, damaged alien. The one that had challenged the hunter before. Ethan tensed, gripping his makeshift spear. This one didn't move like the first. It was slower, more cautious, like it expected to be attacked at any moment. It approached the drawing in the dirt, studied it. Then, to Ethan's shock, it didn't erase his symbol. Instead, it added something new. It reached into a pouch on its side and sprinkled a fine red powder over the crossed-out circles. The glowing dust spread out in delicate, shifting patterns. Ethan squinted, trying to understand. The red powder moved. At first, it seemed random, just loose particles settling into the dirt. But as Ethan watched, he realized something chilling. It was forming shapes. Bodies. The 2 crossed-out species. Their figures were faint, made of nothing but dust and light. But Ethan could see them clearly. They weren't animals. They weren't creatures. They were people. Different from the hunters, different from the thin one in the clearing. But humanoid. Like him. And they were dead. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. A warning or a threat. The thin alien stepped back, looking at the symbols it had drawn. Then, slowly, it turned its head. It was looking directly at Ethan's hiding spot. His pulse spiked. He had been seen. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without breaking eye contact, the thin alien placed a small object on the ground beside the glowing symbols. And then, just as silently as before, it faded into the darkness. Ethan stayed frozen in place. His mind was racing. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was something bigger. The hunters had left a test. The thin one had left a warning. And whatever was happening to this planet, Ethan was right in the middle of it. After a long pause, he climbed down from his hiding place and approached the clearing. His body was tense, every muscle prepared for an ambush. But the area was empty. The only thing left behind was the small object the thin alien had placed on the ground. Ethan knelt down and picked it up. It was a piece of smooth, dark stone, heavy, cool to the touch. As soon as his fingers wrapped around it, a voice echoed inside his head. A whisper, a single word. Run. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He wasn't alone. Something else was coming. Something worse. The truth about the trap. The whisper still echoed in Ethan's mind. Run. But from what? His grip tightened around the smooth, dark stone the thin alien had left for him. It was heavy, oddly warm now, as if reacting to his touch. It felt alive in a way that made his skin crawl. He scanned the trees, his breath controlled, his pulse hammering in his ears. The forest was silent. Too silent. Then, in the distance, he heard it. A low, rhythmic clicking. Not footsteps. Not an animal growl. Something else. Ethan backed away from the clearing, his instincts screaming that he was being hunted. The trap was never for food. Moving carefully, he climbed the rocky path back to higher ground. He needed a better view of the area. He needed to see what was coming. As he reached a ledge overlooking the valley below, he finally spotted them. 3 figures. Not the thin alien. Not the hunter. Something else. They moved in perfect unison, their bodies shifting as if they were made of liquid metal. They didn't walk. They flowed like shadows given form. And then Ethan realized something terrifying. They weren't stepping on the ground. They were floating. They glided effortlessly over the uneven terrain, their dark forms flickering in and out of sight as they moved closer to the clearing. Ethan's mind worked fast. The thin alien had warned him. The hunter had left a test. And these things, they were neither. They were something worse. The clicking sound grew louder, more erratic. The creatures slowed near the spot where the symbols were drawn. One of them bent forward slightly, its form rippling as it studied the markings. Then, all at once, it turned its head toward Ethan. Ethan froze. For a second, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. Then, the floating figure let out a deep, inhuman hiss. The others followed, and suddenly, they were moving, straight toward him. The hunt begins. Ethan didn't wait. He ran. His boots pounded against the rock, his muscles burning as he sprinted toward the trees. Behind him, he could hear the unnatural sound of air shifting, warping. They were faster than him. They weren't running. They were closing the distance without even touching the ground. Ethan dodged between thick roots and twisted branches, trying to put as many obstacles between him and them as possible. He didn't know what they were. He didn't know what they wanted. But one thing was clear. They didn't belong to this planet. Just like him. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't inside his head. It was all around him. A deep, static-filled voice, echoing through the trees. You should not be here. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. That wasn't a warning. That was a sentence. A fight in the dark. His foot caught on a root, sending him tumbling forward. He barely rolled in time, crashing behind a fallen tree. His body ached, but he didn't stop moving. Then, everything went silent. The clicking noise vanished. No movement. No sound. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to control his breathing. He slowly peeked over the log. The 3 figures had stopped. They hovered just a few feet away, watching, waiting. Then one of them tilted its head slightly, and Ethan realized something horrifying. It wasn't looking at him. It was looking past him. The air behind him shifted. A shadow loomed over him. Ethan spun, bringing up his spear. A hand clamped around his wrist. The hunter. The alien moved fast, yanking Ethan backward and throwing him against a tree. Before he could react, the hunter stepped between him and the floating creatures. For a moment, neither side moved. Then, in a single fluid motion, the hunter reached into its armor and pulled out a weapon. Not a gun, not a blade. A small glowing sphere. It held it up, and the floating creatures recoiled. Ethan's mind raced. They were afraid of it. The hunter took a step forward, still holding the sphere. The floating figures let out a high-pitched screech. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. Gone. Not into the trees. Not into the shadows. They simply ceased to exist. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his body still pressed against the rough bark of the tree. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. The hunter turned to him, tilting its head slightly. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in the same whispers Ethan had heard before. You were not meant to see them. Ethan swallowed hard. What are they? He asked. The hunter stared at him for a long time. Then it pointed to the stone in Ethan's hand, the one the thin alien had given him. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper in the wind, it answered. The ones who erased the others. Ethan's fingers clenched around the stone. His stomach turned cold. 2 species. Gone. Wiped out. And now, humanity's turn had come. The alien's warning. Ethan's breath came fast, sharp, controlled, but inside, he was unraveling. The hunter's words echoed in his head. The ones who erased the others. 2 species. Wiped out. The floating creatures, the way they had moved, the way they ceased to exist the moment the hunter confronted them. They weren't just hunters. They were executioners. And now, they had seen Ethan. He tightened his grip on the stone the thin alien had given him, its smooth surface oddly warm, pulsing faintly like a weak heartbeat. He looked at the hunter, his body still tense from the encounter. What do they want? Ethan asked. The hunter didn't answer immediately. It simply stared at him, those glowing blue eyes narrowing slightly. Then it did something Ethan didn't expect. It stepped closer. Not in a threatening way, not like before. This time, it looked at him differently, as if it was considering something, testing him. Finally, the hunter raised one clawed hand and touched its own chest. Then, it reached forward and, without hesitation, touched Ethan's chest. Ethan froze. The contact was brief, just a light tap over his heart, but something passed between them. A single whispered word inside Ethan's mind. Choice. A bigger truth. Ethan's pulse spiked. Choice. What did that mean? He opened his mouth to ask, but before he could speak, the hunter suddenly turned its head. Its body tensed. Something was wrong. Ethan followed its gaze. At first, he saw nothing, just the dark, empty sky and the twisted alien trees swaying in the wind. But then, the sky flickered. A ripple. A distortion, like heat rising from the ground. Then, light. No, not just light. Symbols. Glowing, shifting patterns appeared in the air, forming shapes Ethan didn't recognize. They moved like a living thing, twisting, pulsing, shifting between meanings Ethan couldn't grasp. But the hunter could. It stepped back, fast, its posture changing into something Ethan had never seen before. Fear. The hunter was afraid. The symbols pulsed again. And this time, Ethan understood something. Not because the message changed, but because his own mind adjusted. The stone in his hand suddenly felt heavy, almost unbearable, as if it were pressing something into him. And then the symbols burned themselves into his thoughts. A countdown. 3 cycles remain. Ethan's breath hitched. 3. The hunter turned to him sharply, its voice a whisper in his mind. "They are coming." Ethan's grip tightened on the stone. "Who?" The hunter's blue eyes burned. "The ones who decide. A decision that cannot be undone." The ground trembled slightly, a low hum pulsing through the trees. Ethan didn't know if it was coming from the planet itself, or if it was something else. Something above. Something watching. His mind was spinning. The trap he had set. It had never been about food. The symbols, the warnings, the thin alien. This had never been about survival. This was a trial. The first two species had been tested, and they had failed. Ethan looked back at the hunter. "What happens if I fail?" The hunter didn't answer. It simply raised one clawed hand and slowly, deliberately, dragged it through the air. A universal gesture. Erasure. Ethan swallowed. His entire body felt cold. That was the choice. Not just for him. For humanity. Whatever was coming, it wasn't coming to conquer. It was coming to judge. 3 cycles. 3 days. 3 hours. Time was running out, and Ethan had to decide before it did. The final test. Ethan's heartbeat was like a war drum in his chest. 3 cycles. That's all the time he had left. The hunter stood before him, unmoving, its glowing blue eyes locked onto his. It had given him a warning, a message, and a choice. But what it hadn't given him was a way out. Ethan clenched his jaw. His body ached from exhaustion, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had learned. He had survived on instinct, fought on reflex. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about humanity. And if he failed, there would be nothing left to go back to. The hunter took a step forward, and without hesitation, held out its hand. Ethan hesitated. The last time it had touched him, something passed between them. An unspoken message, an understanding that had burned its way into his thoughts. Now it was happening again. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out. The moment their hands touched, the world disappeared. Into the trial. Ethan gasped as his mind was ripped from his body. Darkness swallowed him whole. Not empty, silent darkness, but a living, shifting void. It pulsed, breathed, moved around him. Then, light. No, not light. Memories. Not his. Humanity's. They flashed before him in rapid bursts. Wars, cities rising, civilizations falling, people fighting, building, struggling, surviving. A storm of moments, triumphs and failures, love and war, cruelty and kindness. It was everything humans were. And then it stopped. Ethan was standing again, but not in the forest. He was in a vast, open arena. The sky above was an endless void, shimmering with strange symbols that pulsed and shifted. Around him, massive stone pillars rose from the ground, their surfaces covered in glowing blue markings. And he wasn't alone. Across from him stood 3 figures. Not the hunter, not the thin alien, not the floating executioners. These beings were different. Tall, cloaked in flowing, shimmering robes that flickered between colors Ethan couldn't name. Their faces were hidden, but their presence was immense. They radiated power, authority, judgment, and Ethan knew these were the ones who decided, the ones who had erased the others, the ones who would now judge him. The trial begins. A deep, resonating voice filled the air, not from the beings before him, but from everywhere at once. You are the last. Ethan swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, but he forced himself to speak. Last of what? The symbols in the sky flickered. The voices spoke as one. The last to be tested. Ethan's grip tightened around the stone in his hand. And if I fail? There was a long silence. Then, slowly, one of the cloaked figures raised a single hand. The air shook. The ground beneath him trembled, and suddenly, around him, the erased ones appeared. Not in physical form, not real, but echoes. Their worlds, their civilizations, their people, all gone, but not forgotten. Ethan saw them as ghosts of light and dust, their cities crumbling, their bodies vanishing, their voices lost in the void. Entire species erased. He turned back to the cloaked figures. You destroy them. The voices echoed. They failed. Ethan took a slow breath, steadying himself. Failed what? The sky shimmered, and suddenly he understood. The test was never about strength, never about intelligence. It was about what it meant to exist, to prove that a species was worthy of continuing. The final choice. One of the figures stepped forward, raising its hand again. This time, a new vision appeared. It was Earth. Ethan's chest tightened. His home. His people. The sky above Earth shimmered, but something was coming. A massive, dark shape, shifting like a living shadow, growing, consuming. The same fate that had taken the others. The test wasn't just about him. It was about them. He turned back to the cloaked beings. So this is it. His voice was sharp now. I either pass your test, or humanity dies. The voices didn't answer. Because they didn't need to. He already knew. Ethan exhaled, his choice suddenly clear. He had been fighting this entire time, running, surviving, trying to understand. But now he knew what had to be done. He stepped forward, gripping the stone tightly, and spoke one final word. No. The air shattered. The arena trembled, the sky split apart, and the glowing symbols exploded in blinding light. The cloaked figures reacted instantly. For the first time, Ethan sensed surprise. And then, everything went white. The final choice, war or alliance. Ethan felt himself falling. Not through air, not through space, but through something deeper. The moment he had spoken no, the world had shattered around him. The vast arena, the glowing symbols, the towering cloaked figures, all of it had collapsed into blinding white light. Now, that light was fading. Slowly, reality began to reform around him. The silence broke. And then, he was standing again. But this time, he wasn't alone. The battlefield of choices. Ethan blinked. He was no longer in the strange, void-like trial space. Instead, he stood in an endless, broken landscape. The ground beneath him was cracked and scorched, as if something immense had burned across it. The sky was split, fractured with deep wounds of darkness that pulsed like something alive. And all around him, there were echoes of war. Towering structures lay in ruins. The bones of colossal, unknown creatures were scattered across the battlefield. Strange metallic husks, asterisk machines, ships, weapons of species long gone, asterisk were buried in the sand. This was where the last ones had fallen, where they had been judged and erased. And now, it was his turn. A low hum vibrated through the air. Ethan turned and saw them. The cloaked ones. Still watching, still waiting. But now, they weren't alone. The hunter stood beside Ethan. And behind the hunter, the thin one emerged from the shadows. And then, more. Figures stepping out from the ruins. Different species, different warriors. All looking at him. All survivors. Ethan's breath hitched. This wasn't just a test anymore. This was a war. And humanity's turn had come. The last question. The cloaked ones finally spoke, their voices vibrating through the broken air. You refuse judgment. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Ethan narrowed his eyes. I refuse to let you decide for us. The air shifted. The ruins trembled slightly. A pulse of unseen energy rippled through the battlefield. Then decide. Ethan took a slow, steady breath. He could feel the weight of every choice before him. 2 species before humanity had failed. Had they fought back? Had they accepted judgment? Had they begged for survival? It didn't matter now. What mattered was his answer. And he only had 2 choices left. Choice 1. The war path. Ethan could raise his weapon. He could call humanity to fight. He could rally the hunter, the thin one, the survivors, the last remnants of species that had been erased. They could take a stand. They could refuse judgment with fire and steel. They could challenge the cloaked ones. But war had failed before. The battlefield beneath his feet was proof. And yet, something inside him still burned. Something that said, maybe this time it would be different. Choice 2. The path of alliance. Or he could drop his weapon. He could step forward, look into the empty, hollow eyes of the cloaked ones, and ask the one question no species had ever asked before. Why? Not, why are you doing this? Not, why do we deserve to be erased? But why do you believe you have the right? Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Ethan had seen it in their reaction when he refused to kneel. The cloaked ones expected obedience. They expected species to fear judgment. But what if humanity didn't? What if, instead of fear, Ethan offered something else? Something they had never encountered before. Understanding. The decision. The battlefield was silent. All eyes were on him. The hunter. The thin one. The other survivors. The cloaked ones, waiting for his choice. Ethan's hand clenched. He took a step forward. Then another. He raised his head and spoke. His voice was strong, unshaken. We do not bow. The cloaked ones stilled. Ethan continued. We do not kneel. But we do not seek war, either. He let the words settle. Let them sink into the bones of this ruined battlefield. If you are our judges, then let us be yours. Let us decide if you are worthy. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time, the cloaked ones did not know what to say. And Ethan, he had his answer. Humanity's test wasn't over. It had just begun.